My name is Daniel Gray. Once, I served in the grand halls of Harrow Hall, polishing silver that would never bear my reflection, and carrying secrets heavier than any tray. One night changed everything. A crime was committed, a scandal that could destroy the name of Edward Harrow, the man I had served faithfully for years. When the moment came, I stood where he should have stood. I took his guilt, his sentence, and his prison cell. For 15 years, I lived behind the walls of Blackwood, where days were measured not in hours, but in the weight of survival. I saw loyalty tested, friendships forged and broken, and the truth of men laid bare in the dark. This is not a tale of justice. It is the confession of a man who traded his freedom for another's name, and learned the true price of silence. I'm Daniel, was born at 1814. I have lived most of my life in silence. Not the peaceful kind, the kind you find in a meadow at dawn or a chapel at prayer. My silence is heavier. It clings to me like the damp air of a cell, like the stale smell of bread left too long in a corner. It is the silence of words unsaid, of truth swallowed whole, of a life rewritten by someone else's hand. People don't remember me now, not in this part of London, at least. I'm just another worn coat among the crowds, another nameless tenant in a narrow room above the cobbler's shop. My neighbors think I am a widower or a failed tradesman. No one asks, and I do not tell. That is how I prefer it. But sometimes, late at night, when the rain slides down the glass and the lamplight flickers just enough to make the room feel alive, I think of the years I lost, the years I gave away. I was 19 when I stepped into the courtroom and left as a convict. The crime was never mine, but the punishment fit me perfectly, or so my master said. A fine suit looks finer when it's spotless, and a fine name sounds cleaner when it's untainted. My name, Daniel Gray, was worth little in the world. His name, Edward Harrow, was worth a fortune, so I carried the stain for him. I never told anyone what truly happened that night at Harrow Hall. I could have spoken. I could have pointed a finger and sent the right man to the gallows, or at least into the papers for a week of public disgrace. But Edward's eyes, calm and steady as the storm raged around us, told me what my mouth could not say. "You'll be taken care of," he promised. "It's only a matter of time before you're free again." Promises, like iron bars, rust slowly, and sometimes they cut when you touch them. It has been 15 years since that night, and still I can smell the perfume from the ballroom, hear the thud of footsteps in the West Wing corridor, feel the weight of Edward's hand on my shoulder. I can still see the flash of panic in his eyes before it hardened into something colder, calculation. What you are about to read is not a confession. It is not even a defense. It is simply the truth as I lived it. A truth that began in the soft-carpeted halls of Harrow Hall, ran through the filth and darkness of Coldford Prison, and ended here, in a room too small for regrets, but somehow big enough to hold them all. If you are reading this, I ask only one thing. Do not look for heroes. You will find none here. Not in Edward. Not in the law. And certainly not in me. I was born in the servants' wing of Harrow Hall, in a narrow attic room that smelled of coal dust and starch. My mother was the head laundress, my father the under-gardener. It was not a bad life for people like us. You had a roof, 3 meals if you worked hard, and a place in the grand machinery of the estate. The machinery ran on polish and quiet. If you were seen, it was by accident. If you were heard, it was by mistake. My mother drilled that into me before I could even tie my boots. "The less they notice you, Danny, the longer you'll keep your place," she used to say. In our world, invisibility was the truest form of safety. The servants' hall was its own kingdom. We had our own rules, our own hierarchy. The cook reigned supreme, second only to the butler, Mr. Graves, a tall, sharp man whose gaze could strip the dust from your collar. Footmen outranked hall boys. Housemaids outranked scullery maids. And every rung of that ladder was something you clung to, because falling even one step could put you out on the road. I started at the very bottom, running messages between the kitchen and the stables. The work was endless and often thankless, polishing boots until my hands ached, hauling water before dawn, brushing mud from the hems of carriages after the family's guests had departed. But there was a rhythm to it, a sense of belonging, even pride, in being part of something bigger than myself. Edward Harrow was 3 years older than me, the only son of Lord and Lady Harrow. I remember the first time I saw him clearly. I was 10, he was 13, dressed in riding clothes finer than any coat I'd ever touched. He had just come in from the hunt, cheeks flushed, hair wind-tossed, a boy who looked as if the whole world had been built for him to ride across. He didn't see me, not really. Not until I handed him his gloves the next morning. He looked at me as though puzzled that a person like me could exist, then, with a small nod, took them without a word. It was the first time I'd ever been acknowledged by one of the family. Over the years, I graduated from stable errands to serving in the main house. I learned the geography of Harrow Hall like the lines on my own hands, the creak in the second step up to the library, the cold draft under the east corridor door, the faint perfume that lingered in Lady Harrow's morning room. And in that time, I learned Edward's habits too. He liked his boots shined before breakfast, his cravat tied with a loose knot, and his whiskey, even as a young man, poured without anyone else noticing. He spoke to me more often than the others. Sometimes it was a request, sometimes an order, and sometimes, rarely, it was almost conversation. I told myself it was trust, maybe even friendship. Looking back, I understand it for what it was, convenience. Edward saw in me a boy who would do what was asked without fuss, who would keep his eyes open and his mouth shut. And in Harrow Hall, that was worth more than any coin. I became Edward Harrow's valet in the spring of 1884. The promotion came without warning. One day I was polishing the silver in the dining room. The next, Mr. Graves informed me that I was to report directly to Master Edward from dawn till night. It was more than a change of duties. It was a shift in my entire existence. As a valet, I was no longer just part of the servant machinery. I was a shadow that followed one man everywhere, the first to see him in the morning, the last to see him at night. My place was in his rooms, his carriage, his confidence. The hours were long and the work exacting. Edward demanded precision. His boots had to shine like black mirrors, his cuffs spotless, his shirts pressed so sharply you could cut yourself on the creases. I learned the art of tying his cravat to match his mood, a tighter knot for formal dinners, a looser one for evenings in town. But beyond the duties, there were moments that felt almost like friendship. Edward spoke to me more freely than to anyone else in the house. While I brushed his coat, he would tell me of the gentlemen's club he had visited, the political debates he had overheard, the women who had smiled at him across the ballroom. Sometimes he would ask my opinion, a dangerous invitation, because a wrong word could end your place in the household. But I answered carefully, and he seemed to enjoy my caution. At night, after he returned from one of his endless engagements, he would sit in the armchair by the fire and pour himself a whiskey. I'd stand nearby, hands clasped behind my back, and he'd talk, not always kindly, but always candidly, about his father's expectations, about debts that no one must know of, about how certain people needed to be dealt with. I told myself these conversations were proof of trust, that I mattered to him in some way. Looking back, I see they were something else entirely, a test, perhaps, or a way for him to measure just how loyal I would be when pressed. My loyalty was never in question. I remember one winter night in particular. Snow had fallen thick over the grounds, and Edward returned from London in a foul mood. He threw his gloves onto the floor and muttered about a certain gentleman who had forgotten his place. I asked if I should prepare his bed, but he waved me off and poured another drink. "You're a good man, Daniel," he said after a long silence, staring into the fire. "Better than most, I know. I hope you understand that sometimes unpleasant things must be done for the sake of the family." I nodded, though I didn't fully understand. It wasn't my place to question. In Harrow Hall, understanding was optional. Obedience was not. In that moment, I thought I was closer to Edward Harrow than anyone else alive. I didn't realize how dangerous it can be to stand too close to another man's fire. The west wing of Harrow Hall was rarely used. It was a place of shut doors, heavy drapes, and cold air that smelled faintly of lavender long gone stale. Lady Harrow claimed it was draughty and unpleasant. Mr. Graves said it was impractical to heat so many rooms. I had always suspected the truth was simpler. The family liked their mysteries. That night, I was not meant to be there. Edward had returned from London earlier than expected. The carriage wheels crunched on the frosted gravel just past midnight, and by the time I opened the front door, he was already striding in, cheeks flushed from drink and cold. He didn't greet me. He went straight for the stairs, his boots leaving dark patches on the carpet. "Bring the key to the west wing," he said over his shoulder. "Now." It was not a request. I retrieved the iron key from Mr. Graves' desk, the one that only left its hook for servants trusted beyond question, and followed Edward. He moved quickly, almost urgently, his steps echoing in the unlit corridor. The lock turned with a groan. Dust rose in the air, visible in the flicker of my lamp. Inside, the west wing felt like stepping into another world. The furniture was draped in white sheets like pale ghosts, and the wallpaper had yellowed where sunlight had crept in over the years. Edward walked ahead, his shadow tall against the faded walls. We reached the third door on the left. He stopped, glanced at me, then opened it. I will not forget what I saw. A figure, slumped in the armchair by the cold fireplace. Clothes too fine for a servant, hair in disarray, one hand dangling toward the floor where a glass had tipped and rolled. The smell in the air, sharp, metallic, told me more than sight ever could. Edward's voice was steady. "They fell. An accident." I knew better than to ask who they were, or why Edward's hands trembled only when they were out of my sight. My role was clear. I was the one who fetched water when he told me to, the one who wiped the spilled liquor, the one who locked the door again when we left. We walked back through the west wing in silence. Only when we reached the main hall did he turn to me. "You never saw them. You were never there." And because my life had been built on obedience, I said, "Yes, sir." It was the first lie. It would not be the last. By morning, the household was restless. Servants moved faster than usual, their eyes darting between one another, voices lowered to murmurs that stopped when I entered a room. Mr. Graves's mouth was tighter than I had ever seen it, and the cook banged pans loud enough to drown her own unease. The west wing stayed locked. Edward stayed in his study, the curtains drawn despite the pale winter sun. I brought him breakfast on a silver tray, coffee, toast, eggs, but he barely touched it. He looked as though he had been awake all night. "Has anyone been in there?" he asked quietly, not specifying where. "No, sir." "Good. Keep it that way." By noon, a carriage bearing the crest of the constabulary arrived. Two men in dark coats stepped out, their boots polished, their expressions as unreadable as the law itself. They were led into the drawing room, where Edward greeted them with the easy charm that had always opened doors for him. I lingered outside the door, under the pretense of dusting the hallway table. The voices inside were muffled, but I caught enough to know the visitor in the west wing had not been expected. Words like unfortunate, discretion, and inquiry floated out in Edward's even tone. There was no tremor in his voice now. By evening, the questioning began. One by one, servants were called into the library. When my turn came, the air in the room felt colder than the snow outside. A constable asked where I had been the previous night, what I had seen, and whether I had been in the West Wing. I told the second and third lies of my life in the space of 2 minutes. No, sir, I was in my quarters after 10. I did not see anyone unusual. The constable's eyes were sharp. You're Edward Harrow's valet? Yes, sir. Close to him, then. I serve him, sir. It was a simple answer, but Edward glanced at me from his chair near the fire. Just a glance, but I understood it. Hold steady. The investigation stretched on for days. The visitor's name, a gentleman from London, was never spoken aloud, but I heard enough to guess at scandal. It was whispered that there had been debts, perhaps a quarrel, perhaps more. But the whispers began to circle closer to me. I had been seen fetching the West Wing key. My boots had left marks in the corridor carpet. My lamp had been spotted through the window. Edward did not speak of it, but he did not deny it either. When the constables returned for a second round of questioning, his absence from the room was louder than any accusation. And then, one night in the servants' hall, Mr. Graves dismissed the others and looked at me long and hard. Master Edward says you'll stand in his place, he said. It will be better that way. For the family. For the family. As if I had always been part of it. As if that meant I had a choice. I didn't sleep that night. The servants' quarters were quiet, but my mind churned like the sea in a storm. I lay on my narrow bed, staring at the beams above me, replaying Mr. Graves's words. It will be better that way. For the family. By morning, Edward sent for me. I found him in his study, the air thick with tobacco smoke. He was standing by the window, hands clasped behind his back, looking out at the frost-crusted gardens. When he turned, his face was calm, almost gentle. Daniel, he began, you know how this must look to the outside world. A guest dies in our home. Whispers of an argument. The press sniffing for scandal. If they smell blood, they will ruin us. My father, my mother, me. I said nothing. My throat felt tight. He stepped closer. You've been with me for years. I've trusted you more than anyone. I won't forget that. He paused, then added, if you say the wrong thing to the constables, they'll think I've lied. They'll think I've hidden something. But if you take responsibility, just enough to close their book, I can see to it you re-looked after. Looked after. The words were soft, but heavy. I thought of my parents, long buried. I thought of the cold roads outside the estate gates. Of men sleeping in alleys with nothing to their name. I thought of the fact that I had no life but this one. You'd be out in a year, Edward said, maybe less. There'd be money for you after. A fresh start somewhere else. I wanted to ask why me, but I already knew. Because I would say yes. Because I was the kind of man who had been trained, since boyhood, to keep another man's hands clean. That afternoon, I was called to the library for a third round of questioning. Edward did not attend. The constables asked again about the West Wing, about the visitor, about the night in question. I hesitated, just for a moment, and then the words came out. Yes, I was there. It was an accident. The questions changed after that. Dates, times, whether I had argued with the man. I agreed when I could, denied nothing too forcefully. The confession was shaping itself without my help. When it was over, one of the constables closed his notebook and said, "You'll come with us." I glanced toward the doorway. Edward was there, leaning against the frame. His expression was unreadable, but when our eyes met, he gave the smallest of nods, as if to say, "Good man." The cuffs were cold on my wrists. I walked out of Harrow Hall between two strangers. Down the gravel drive I had polished and swept 100 times. The frost crunched under my boots. I did not look back. They took my name first. Not the sound of it that stayed in my head like a song you cannot shake, but the thing it was attached to. In the registry book, a clerk with ink-stained fingers wrote Daniel Gray only once, then scratched through it and replaced it with a number. The number was repeated 3 times. On a paper slip, on a tin disc they pressed into my palm. And on the back of my coat in white paint that smelled of turpentine and something like despair. The clerk did not look up at me when he said, "Answer to it smartly," as if I had ever had the luxury of answering slowly. The gate closed behind me with a sound I felt in my teeth. It wasn't the delicate click of a latch at Harrow Hall, but a long iron shriek that ended in a dull, decisive thud. The yard beyond was a rectangle of mud, trapped inside 4 walls too high to measure with your eyes. The sky looked farther away in there, as if it too had been sentenced. They marched us 6 of us that day across the yard to the bathhouse. Bath was the word the guard used. He had a voice that could cut bread, all sharp edges and no softness. Inside, steam hung like a low cloud. We were ordered to undress and stand with our backs to the wall. I remember the cold stone under my feet more than anything. The floor was wet, slick with a sheen of soap that did not smell like any soap I had known. A ladle of water was thrown at each of us in turn. It ran down my spine with such suddenness that I gasped. The guard's mouth twitched either with amusement or irritation. I could not tell. Then the haircut. I had been shorn neatly as a footman plenty of times, but this was not neat. This was quicker than quick, a rasping of blades that left the scalp prickled and raw. Hair fell in dark commas around my feet and slid away on the wet floor like little eels trying to escape. When the barber, if barber he was, turned my head, he did it with 2 fingers, as if I were something that might stain. The clothes they issued were coarse and heavy, a faded brown that made every man look like every other man. There is a particular humiliation in buttoning a jacket identical to your neighbor. It is the ceremony by which you enter a world without mirrors. I thought of the cravats I had tied, the linen I had pressed, the way Edward liked a particular looseness that said ease without neglect. I could not square that memory with the crude knot at my throat now, but I tied it anyway. The lessons of obedience were not unlearned by iron. We were led to the infirmary for a look over that consisted of a hand to the forehead and a glance at the eyes, then clattered back into the corridor. What struck me most was the sound, the whole place full of it, even when no one spoke. Keys, boots, metal on metal. Somewhere far off, a bucket scraped the floor. Closer by, a cough worked its way loose from a chest and broke in 2 like a stick. The prison breathed around me in its own rhythm. At a table near a barred window, another clerk read out rules without looking at the faces they were meant to bind. Silence at muster. Hands visible at all times. Hat off to officers. Bread at dawn, broth at noon, bread at dusk. Work assigned daily. Failure punished daily. Church on Sunday. No letters without permission. No visits without notice. Nothing, really, without someone else deciding. Each rule dropped like a stone into a well and did not splash. Stand straight when spoken to, the guard barked. My spine obliged before my mind did. They put me in D wing, 2nd tier, cell 23. The stair was iron and rang underfoot. The landing bowed a little with each step, so that when 3 men walked it together, you could feel their weight travel under your boots. Cell 23 had a door with a hatch the size of a book. When it opened, you saw a strip of eye and one edge of a mouth. When it closed, you saw nothing at all. Inside, a plank bed bolted to the wall, a thin mattress banded with twine, a bucket, a shelf, a Bible swollen with damp. The smell was of old water and new sweat with a thread of vinegar beneath it, as if someone had tried and failed to drown the room in cleanliness. There was a window, very high, with glass so thick with grime, the light came in the way rain does more a rumor than a fact. My cellmate was already there. He looked at me without moving anything but his eyes. Middle-aged, perhaps, or made to look it. Hair the color of ash, a jaw set as if it had been clamped there. When he stood, he did so slowly, with the careful dignity of a man who has learned that haste invites harm. "Name?" he asked. I hesitated, Habit, but the number would be required soon enough. 23, I said, and then Daniel. He nodded at the bucket, then at the bed. Top or bottom? There's a choice? Little ones, he said. Take 'em when they come. I took the top. I had slept in attics all my life, and there was a comfort in height, even if it was 3 feet and a splintered board. I set the tin disc with my number on the shelf and smoothed the mattress with my palm. The fabric scratched my hand. For a moment I found myself rubbing it the way a housemaid might test a cloth for quality. Reflex is a stubborn thing. The first bell, if it was a bell, sounded like a metal bar struck with another metal bar. The corridor filled with feet. A hatch opened, and a hand placed a wedge of bread and a cup of something not quite tea on the floor. "No talking," came the voice, and the hatch shut again with the finality of a lid. We ate as you eat when food is not a question, but a command, quickly, without judgment. The bread was yesterday's. The tea was a memory of a leaf that had been in the room at some point in the past. I would not have served it to the lowest stable lad at Harrow Hall, but it sat very well in my stomach all the same. Only then did my cellmate speak again. "Miller," he said, pointing a thumb at himself. 2 years remaining. Keep your eyes to your own feet, and you might keep them. This passed for advice. What did you do? I asked before I could stop the words. He chewed the bread and did not look at me. I carry rocks from one place to another. That's what I do. The lesson blushed my face for me. We were not men with stories in here. We were tasks with lungs. We were led out to the yard again before dusk for muster. The cold reached for the knuckles first, then the ears. We stood in rows and answered numbers. The officer moved like a chess piece between us, rarely looking up from the page he was filling with ticks. When he reached me, he paused longer than elsewhere. "You're new," he said, as if I did not know it. "Yes, sir." "Stand straighter." I tried, and in trying, I knew he had found the one thing he wanted to find, the part of me that still wished to please. It is a dangerous limb to leave exposed. After muster, there was chapel. I had been to services before Harrow Hall, was nothing if not pious in the correct ways, but this was different. The air in the chapel was warmer, almost a mercy, and men breathed as if they could not quite trust it. The chaplain spoke of forgiveness, as if it were a rope lowered from a wall. You had only to reach and hold. I looked around at the bent heads and thought of ropes I had seen and what they had been used for. Back in the cell, night came on quickly. It arrived as a heaviness you could not push off your chest, a weight that sat and sat. Miller laid himself down without ceremony and was asleep with the sound a man makes when he gives up to gravity. I lay above him and tried to count the spaces between footsteps in the corridor. I tried to separate the sounds, keys, boots, a cough, the far-off squeal of a barrow's wheel, and give each one a name. Naming things is how you tame them. Every servant knows that. But the sounds would not be tamed, and each time I reached for one, it changed into another. Sometime after the last patrol went by, the wall shifted. Not the bricks themselves, but my understanding of them. They were not just barriers. They were things that had been touched by hands, warmed by breath, leaned against by backs that shook with quiet tears. This made them bearable in a small way, and intolerable in a large one. In the half-light I could see, just the corner where the paint had bubbled from damp and flaked away. Beneath it, someone had scratched a mark in the plaster, as small as a secret, one straight line crossed by another. A cross, perhaps, or two tally marks who had decided to marry. I put my thumb to it, as if the stone might remember the man who carved it. It was smooth from years of being read that way. I do not know when I slept. I know only that I woke with my heart hammering, and the taste of iron in my mouth, as if I had been running in a dream, and bit my tongue to keep from shouting. Miller was awake already, sitting on the edge of the lower plank, tying his boots with a deliberation that suggested he had no intention of starting the day more than once. "Up," he said softly. "They like you ready before they like you awake." I dropped from the bunk and hit the floor with more noise than I intended. The corridor had already begun its metal music. A hatch opened, and the same wedge of bread arrived as if by magic. My number was called. I answered to it. There are many ways to lose yourself. The grand ways are for the rich, with ships and cities and scandal. For the rest of us, it happens in a room 10 feet long by 6 feet wide, when the hatch opens and a hand you do not see places your breakfast on the ground, and you say nothing at all. On the second morning, I discovered I was already walking to the door before the key had turned. It is a small thing, and perhaps you will think it not worth noting, but I felt it like the first hair falling under a rough blade, the beginning of a new shape made by other hands. I told myself I would keep a part of me clean, a space no rule could reach. I did not know where to keep it in the fold of a thought, in the curl of my handwriting when no one watched, in the way I smoothed the blanket as if it were a gentleman's lapel. I chose all three, and a few more I invented as I went along. They were my secret pockets. I would learn to sew them tighter in the weeks to come. For now, I folded the bread in half to make it seem more than it was, and put my thumb to the cross in the plaster, and counted the steps to the yard so that they added up to the same number each time, even if the prison had other ideas. The yard was the only place where the sky felt real, but even there, it came with conditions. 4-wall stone older than the men who guarded them rose, so high you could barely see the clouds unless you tilted your head back until your neck ached. And if you stood like that for too long, someone would bark at you to keep your eyes down. Morning muster bled into work detail. The cold bit first, and the wind carried the smell of damp stone, sweat, and something metallic that seemed to cling to the inside of your nose. Miller and I were assigned to the same chain 6 men roped together at the waist like unwilling teammates in a race no one wanted to win. Our task was simple in name: move rubble from one side of the yard to the other. The stones were chunks of wall from a collapsed storage building. We hauled them in wheelbarrows that screeched with every turn, their wooden handles smooth from 1,000 desperate grips. A guard in a thick coat strolled behind us, swinging a cane, not to strike, but to remind. The sound of it hitting his boot with each step was more effective than any shout. Miller leaned close when the guard drifted out of earshot. "First week's the worst," he said. "Because of the work?" I asked. "Because it teaches you the work will never end. The stones were heavy, but it was the rhythm that crushed you. Lift, walk, dump, return. The cold made your fingers stiff. The rope at your waist chafed with every step. By the 5th trip, the backs of my legs burned. By the 10th, my breath felt like steam in a frozen pipe, ready to split. There was no talking officially. Unofficially, words slipped between us when the guards turned away. A man named Corbin, 3 places down the chain, muttered about bread rations being cut last winter. Another small, wiry, with eyes that never settled hummed a tune so low it might have been a prayer. When we paused to rest, I saw the older prisoner's trick, leaning against the wheelbarrow handles so it looked like you were simply steadying them. My hands copied theirs without thinking. In this place, you learned by watching. No one explained. Explanation was a luxury, and luxuries had no business here. The midday bell nor a clang of metal on metal brought broth. The steam curled in the air and vanished before it reached your face. It tasted of salt and little else, but it was hot, and that counted for something. Miller tore his bread in half, without looking at me, passing one piece over as if by accident. Why? I asked quietly. He shrugged. You'll last longer if you can still walk at dusk. The guard's cane tapped the ground sharply, ending any chance for more. The afternoon work was slower, the weight of the day pressing down on each of us. My shoulders ached in a way I'd never known even. The long hours polishing silver at Harrow Hall had not reached this deep. There, pain had been an inconvenience. Here, it was a companion you couldn't shake. As we returned the empty barrows and lined them against the wall, I saw it, a carving on one of the stones at the yard's edge. Just a small mark, 2 lines crossing like the one in my cell. I wanted to touch it, but the guard's shadow fell across it before I could. When the chain was removed from my waist, the skin underneath was raw. I rubbed it without thinking, and the guard noticed. You'll toughen up, he said, almost kindly, before adding, or you won't. Back in the cell, Miller climbed into his bunk without a word. I lay on mine, staring at the ceiling, the smell of cold stone still in my nose, the rhythm of lift-walk-dump return pounding in my muscles. The yard had taught me 2 things that day. 1, there was no such thing as none here. 2, a small kindness half a piece of bread could feel heavier than a stone. The 3rd morning in Blackwood Prison began like the others' boots on stone, the scrape of the cell door, the barked order to rise. But something in the air had shifted. The guard's eyes lingered longer. The prisoners spoke less. Miller noticed it too. Keep your head low today, he muttered as we lined up in the corridor. Why? He didn't answer. Just gave me that sideways look, the kind that says you'll find out soon enough. We weren't sent to the yard this time. Instead, the line turned toward the laundry house, a long, low building that steamed even in the cold. The air inside was thick with heat and the sour smell of wet cloth. 2 giant vats of boiling water hissed as steam curled toward the ceiling. The work was faster here. Shirts and trousers dumped into one vat, stirred with long wooden poles, pulled out dripping and heavy, then fed through rollers to squeeze them dry. The rollers squealed with every turn. My hands burned from the change in temperature, the skin tightening with every plunge into hot water. I was paired with a man named Keenan, short, wide-shouldered, with the flattened nose of someone who had broken it more than once. His grip on the wooden pole was as casual as it was dangerous. You're Harrow's man, aren't you? He said without looking at me. The name hit harder than the steam. I used to work for Mr. Harrow, yes. That makes you interesting. He didn't elaborate, but I felt the weight of his gaze even when he turned back to the vat. By the second load of uniforms, I understood that the other men in the laundry were watching me more than the work. Not openly, never openly, but in sidelong glances and the faintest curve of a smile when Keenan asked another question. What's he paying you? He asked, rolling the fabric through the press with ease. I'm not sure what you mean. Sure you are. His voice stayed calm, almost friendly. No one comes in here for free. I didn't answer, and that seemed to satisfy him in its own way. Silence could be more dangerous than words here. At midday, we were given mugs of lukewarm water and a few minutes to sit. Miller was across the room, folding uniforms with another team. He caught my eye and gave the slightest shake of his head, the same warning as before. By the time the day's load was finished, my arms ached worse than they had in the yard. The wet weight of the clothes, the constant turning of the rollers, the heat it drained you in a way that didn't leave visible marks. On the walk back to the cells, Keenan fell in step beside me. You ever need something? He said quietly. You come to me. But it'll cost you. What if I don't need anything? He smiled, just enough to show the edge of a tooth. Then you're still in my debt. That's how it works here. That night, I lay awake on my bunk, listening to the distant clank of a cell door and the low murmur of voices through stone. Blackwood was beginning to show its real face, not just the labor, the cold, the hunger, but the invisible web of debts and alliances. I didn't know yet if Miller was part of that web. I only knew I was already tangled in it. The first fight I saw in Blackwood didn't start with a shout. It started with a cough. A wet, hacking cough from a man named Ellis, who worked in the yard crew. He bent to pick up a stone, slipped, and the wheelbarrow tipped. Rocks spilled onto the boots of another prisoner, Hobbs, tall and narrow, with a jaw that always looked clenched. Hobbs didn't curse. He just kicked the wheelbarrow over completely, the sound sharp as a gunshot in the cold air. The guards were at the far end of the yard. Nobody was going to stop it. By the time Ellis got to his feet, Hobbs had a fist in his collar, and then it was on fast, ugly, a tangle of arms and fists in the mud. Men turned to watch, but no one moved to help, except Miller. He stepped forward, pulling Ellis away just long enough to break the momentum. Hobbs swung at him instead, and Miller caught the blow on his forearm. The guards noticed then, their whistles cutting through the air, and the fight scattered like crows. But the damage was done. In the eyes of Hobbs and his circle, Miller had chosen a side. That afternoon, while we shoveled snow into carts, Miller came up beside me. "Stay close to me for a while," he said. Because of Hobbs? Because of what's coming? I didn't have to wait long to find out. In the mess hall that evening, the benches were crowded, the air thick with the smell of boiled grain. Keenan slid onto the bench across from me, setting his tin bowl down with deliberate care. "You're quiet, Harrow's man," he said. "I'm tired," I answered. "That's good. Tired men don't make trouble. But trouble's coming anyway." He leaned forward. "You've got Miller watching your back. That means you're with him, which means you're not with Hobbs. And in here, not choosing is still choosing." I kept my eyes on my bowl, but my ears caught the low hum of agreement from the men around him. Later, in the dim corridor back to the cells, Hobbs brushed past me. Not a shove, not even a hard shoulder, just enough contact to say, "I know who you are now." In my cell, Miller sat on his bunk, head in his hands. "Trouble?" I asked. "Trouble," he confirmed. "They'll test you before the week's out. See if you stand or fold." I thought of Edward Harrow, of the nod he'd given me as the cuffs went on, and wondered if I'd already folded long before I stepped into Blackwood. The choice, it seemed, had never really been mine. It happened on the 5th morning after the fight in the yard. The day began the same boots slapping stone, breath hanging in the cold air, but the tension was there, a thread strung tight between every step. Miller and I were assigned to latrine duty, which meant hauling waste barrels out past the far wall to the dumping pit. It was miserable work, but far from the guards' eyes. And that was the point. 2 other prisoners were assigned with us. One was a lanky man with a shaven head I'd seen talking with Hobbs. The other was broader, slower, the kind whose weight alone made him dangerous. We didn't exchange names. Names weren't necessary for what was about to happen. The pit was behind a screen of timber, the smell hitting before you saw it. We set the barrels down. I was bending to unfasten the rope when the first blow landed a punch to my ribs that stole the air from my lungs. I staggered, turned, and saw the broad one stepping in, his shadow blocking the thin morning light. The shaven-headed man moved behind me. They didn't yell, didn't taunt. This wasn't about theatrics. It was a job. I tried to step sideways, but the shaven man caught my arm, twisting it hard. Pain flared bright in my shoulder. The broad one drove a fist toward my jaw, but I ducked just enough for it to glance off. Still, The shock of it rattled my teeth. Miller's voice cut through. Enough! He was on them before I could draw a breath, shoving the broad man back into the timber screen so hard it shuddered. The shaven man let go of me, turning toward Miller, and I took the chance to slam my shoulder into his side. He grunted, more surprised than hurt. It didn't last. A whistle pierced the air. One of the guards, closer than we thought. The two attackers stepped back immediately, faces calm, hands raised like they'd been helping us all along. "What's going on here?" the guard barked. "Barrel slipped," Miller said smoothly, jerking his thumb toward the timber. "Nearly hit him." The guard's eyes narrowed, but he didn't press. "Get back to it." We worked in silence after that, the barrels heavier than before. I could feel my ribs with every breath. Back in the cell, Miller dropped onto his bunk. "That was your test," he said. "Did I pass? You're still here, aren't you?" He gave a thin smile. "Next time, you might not have me to tip the scales." That night, lying in the dark, I understood the rules more clearly. Blackwood didn't just break your body, it weighed your value. You had to prove again and again that you were worth the trouble of keeping alive. And every test carried a cost. It was during supper the next evening that Keenan made his move. The mess hall buzzed with the usual din clatter of tin bowls, low curses over thin stew, but when he slid onto the bench beside me, the noise seemed to fade. "You handled yourself," he said without preamble. "Not well, maybe, but enough." I didn't answer. My ribs still ached, and the memory of the pit was too fresh. He tore a piece of bread from his portion and set it on the table between us. "Consider it a handshake." "I don't need your bread." "Everyone needs something, Harrow's man. Today it's bread. Tomorrow it might be a warning before Hobbs decides you've lived too long." I glanced across the hall. Hobbs was at his usual table, speaking low to the men around him, his eyes fixed elsewhere. But even without looking my way, I knew he was aware of this conversation. Keenan leaned closer. "You're drifting in here, and that's how you drown. You need a rope. I can be that rope if you pull your weight. And if I don't, then one day you'll be carrying a barrel and the rope will slip." He smiled faintly. I thought about Miller. He'd already risked himself for me twice. He couldn't do it forever. And in Blackwood, being caught between two sides was worse than choosing wrong. You became fair game for both. "What do you want?" I asked. Keenan shrugged. "Small things, favors, a message carried, a set of eyes where mine can't be. You won't even know they're favors until I collect." It was a bad bargain. I knew it. But it was also the only one on the table. "Fine," I said. "Good man." He pushed the bread closer. "Eat, you'll need the strength." Later in the cell, Miller caught sight of the bread on my bunk. "Keenan?" I nodded. "Be careful," he said. "With him, there's no such thing as a small debt." I didn't reply. The truth was, I'd already made my choice when I sat down beside Keenan and didn't walk away. In here, survival didn't come from clean hands. It came from knowing which ones to shake and when to let them close around yours. That night, I lay awake, listening to the rhythm of the prison, the distant shouts, the muffled clang of iron gates, and thought about ropes. Some pulled you to safety. Some dragged you under. And in Blackwood, it was never easy to tell the difference. The first time Keenan collected, it was almost gentle. No threats, no raised voice, just a quiet nod in the yard one morning, and a low instruction as we passed each other by the wall. "West corridor, laundry house, after supper." I didn't ask questions. In Blackwood, asking was an invitation for trouble. But all day, I carried the weight of it like a stone in my pocket. The laundry house was nearly empty when I arrived, the steam still clinging to the air from the day's work. Keenan was there, leaning against a wall as if he owned the place. Beside him stood a wiry man I'd never seen before, face pockmarked, eyes sharp as nails. "This is Finch," Keenan said. "You're going to help him move something." The something turned out to be a bundle wrapped in coarse linen, about the size of a loaf of bread, but heavier, solid. Finch handed it to me without a word. The weight was strange dense, metallic, and the fabric smelled faintly of oil. We took the side passage, avoiding the main hall. The bundle shifted in my hands as we walked, and I caught a dull clink from inside. Coins, maybe. Or tools. I didn't want to know. Finch stopped at a storage room near the kitchens, where the lock was already broken. Inside, in the dim light, a man sat on a crate. He had the posture of someone who wasn't used to waiting. "From Keenan," Finch said. The man opened the bundle just enough for me to glimpse the contents, a set of short, jagged metal files, the kind that could wear through more than just fabric. He closed it quickly, nodded once, and disappeared through the far door. Back in the corridor, Finch grinned. "Not so hard, was it?" I didn't answer. My palms were damp, and the metallic scent clung to my fingers long after the bundle was gone. When I saw Keenan later, he was sitting at a mess hall table, eating like nothing had happened. "You did well," he said without looking up. "What was in it?" "You don't want to know. Trust me, it's better that way." I wanted to argue, to say I wasn't here to be part of whatever this was. But the truth was, I was part of it now. And in Blackwood, the moment you carried something for someone else, you carried their shadow too. That night, Miller watched me from his bunk. "You're in deeper," he said quietly. "Maybe." "There's no maybe in here, Daniel." He was right. The first debt had been paid. But I could already feel the next one forming, somewhere out there in the dark. The second debt came 3 nights later. I was half asleep, the cold seeping through the thin blanket, when the cell door scraped open. No keys, no guard footsteps. Just Keenan's voice, low and quick. "Get up," quietly. Miller stirred but didn't speak. He just watched me pull on my boots and follow Keenan into the corridor. We slipped through the shadows, past the mess hall, into the older wing of Blackwood, the one the guards called the dead end. Most of the cells here were empty, their doors hanging open like black mouths. Keenan stopped at the last cell. Inside, a mattress lay half off the bunk, stuffing spilling out in gray tufts. "Lift it," he said. Underneath, stitched into the fabric, was a patch of rough thread. Keenan handed me a small knife. "Cut it. Careful." The blade parted the seams, and from inside I drew a bundle of papers, folded tight and bound with string. When I opened the top sheet, my breath caught thin lines drawn in charcoal, marked with small symbols. I knew what it was before Keenan spoke. "A map," he said, "of Blackwood. Tunnels, blind spots, guard rotations. Took 2 years to make." I swallowed. "Whose is it?" "Not yours to ask. You're just holding it until morning." I wanted to refuse, to put it back in the mattress and walk away, but Keenan's eyes had that flat, weightless look, like the decision had already been made for me. I tucked the papers under my shirt. "Why me?" I asked. "Because Hobbs's men don't watch you the way they watch me," Keenan said. "And because if you get caught, nobody will suspect I was involved." Back in my cell, Miller didn't pretend to sleep. "What is it?" he asked. "Something I don't want to have." He sat up. "Keenan's playing a bigger game. If that's what I think it is, you're holding a death sentence." I lay awake until the gray light of morning bled through the bars, the paper's edges itching against my skin. Somewhere in this prison, someone had drawn a way out. And now, somehow, I was part of it. The thought should have been a spark of hope. Instead, it felt like a fuse waiting to be lit. I didn't make it past breakfast before the first sign of trouble. The mess hall felt different that morning. Not louder, quieter. Conversations were clipped, eyes darting between tables. Hobbs sat in his usual corner, but he wasn't eating. He was watching, and he was watching me. I tried to keep my head down, spooning the thin porridge, but every movement felt deliberate, staged. The map was still under my shirt, wrapped in a strip of cloth and tied against my ribs. It wasn't heavy, but it might as well have been a millstone. Halfway through the meal, a shadow fell across my table. A guard Reeves, the one with the permanent scowl, nodded at me. "Move." Miller's eyes flicked up, sharp with warning. I stood slowly, following Reeves out into the yard. The cold air slapped me awake, but it didn't clear the knot in my gut. We stopped by the wall, out of earshot. Reeves leaned close. "You've been walking around with something that doesn't belong to you." "I don't know what you mean." His lip curled. "You will, sooner than you think." Before I could answer, another voice cut in. "Reeves." It was Keenan, striding toward us like he owned the yard. "Warden wants you in the East Wing, now." Reeves glared, but left without a word. Keenan didn't look at me until Reeves was gone. "You see how fast this spreads?" Hobbs has ears in every wall, and a few guards on his leash. You've got maybe a day before someone decides to search you. My throat was dry. "So what do I do? You give it to me?" "No." His smile was thin. "Good. If you'd handed it over, I'd know you weren't worth the trouble." He leaned in, voice barely above a whisper. "You hide it. Not in your cell, not on you. Somewhere no one will look. If you can manage that for 2 days, the map will be someone else's problem." I didn't trust him, but I didn't have another choice. That night, while the others slept, I slid the map from under my shirt and wrapped it again, this time inside a layer of fabric torn from my blanket. I waited for the footsteps of the guard to fade, then slipped it into the hollow of the water barrel in the corner of the laundry house. The stench would keep most people away. Back in my bunk, Miller whispered, "It's safe? For now." "Then you'd better pray, for now is long enough." I lay in the dark, listening for any sound from the yard. Every creak of the prison seemed louder, every shadow longer. The map was hidden, but so was a trap, and I couldn't tell if I just stepped into it. Keenan's favor came with a cost I was only beginning to understand. It started with small requests, messages to carry, whispered warnings, items to deliver. Each task seemed harmless enough, but the weight of them settled in my chest like lead. The men who took these favors never showed gratitude. They showed expectation. One evening, Keenan approached me in the laundry room, eyes sharp as ever. "Got a job for you," he said, voice low. "Not for the faint of heart." He handed me a folded slip of paper sealed with a crude stamp. "Deliver this to Cell Block C, 3rd tier." No questions. I pocketed the note, heart pounding. Cell Block C was a dangerous place, a maze of narrow corridors and darker shadows. Many who went in didn't come out the same. On my way, I felt eyes following me, hidden and open alike. When I reached the cell, I slipped the note through the bars. The prisoner inside, a man, known only as Harris, nodded once, but said nothing. Returning to the laundry, I saw Hobbs watching me from a distance. Our eyes met briefly before he turned away. That night, Miller warned me quietly. "Favor comes due, Daniel. You don't want to owe more than you can pay." Days later, the prison erupted in violence. A fight broke out in the mess, Hall steel fists, broken chairs, screams that echoed down the halls. I watched from my cell window as guards struggled to regain control. Rumors swirled that the unrest was sparked by a betrayal. Someone had tipped off the wardens about secret communications. Whispers blamed a map, a plan, and debts unpaid. Keenan's smile never reached his eyes when he met mine afterward. "You're deeper in this than you know," he said. I clenched my fists, wondering how much longer I could hold on before everything I had became a chain dragging me under. News traveled slowly inside Blackwood, but when it came, it hit like a thunderclap. I heard whispers first, hushed conversations in the laundry, the odd phrase slipped in the yard. Edward Harrow had left England. Gone to the continent, they said. A new wife, a new life, far from the shadows of Harrow Hall and whatever stain I'd become. At first, I refused to believe it. Why would he abandon the one who had taken the fall? But the silence from the estate was deafening. No letters arrived. No visits came. No word from the family that once seemed untouchable. I wrote to him once, a simple letter, folded with care, filled with nothing but questions I dared not speak aloud. The reply never came. Night after night, I sat alone in the dim light of my cell, tracing memories of Harrow Hall like a faded painting. The grand halls, the polished silver, Edward's shadow, all distant echoes now. Miller sat beside me once and said, "He's moved on. You're not the man he remembers." I didn't answer. Couldn't. The walls closed in, but so did the emptiness. I was a ghost, both inside and out, caught between the man I'd been and the prisoner I'd become. If Edward had forgotten me, the world certainly would too. Night after night, the same restless thoughts gnawed at me, driving me to pick up a scrap of paper and a stub of pencil. The candle flickered as I wrote, the words spilling out like the breath I'd held for years. I wrote not to send, but to remember to tell the truth no one else wanted to hear. I wrote of my childhood under the cold gaze of Harrow Hall, of the whispered commands and silent obedience that shaped me. I wrote of the night in the West Wing, the heavy silence that followed, and the weight of a secret I bore alone. I wrote of the days in Blackwood Prison, the ache in my bones, and the faces of men I'd come to know, friends, foes, and shadows. Each word was a release, a flicker of light in the dark, but the letter remained folded and tucked beneath the thin mattress of my bed. It was a confession I had no courage to share, a burden I could only carry in ink. Sometimes I imagined Edward reading it, feeling a flicker of guilt or regret. Sometimes I imagined no one would ever read it, and it would vanish like me, forgotten and alone. In the end, it didn't matter. The letter was for me, the man who once stood in another's shadow and learned what it truly meant to be unseen. The day my name was called for release, the sun was barely a pale promise behind heavy clouds. I stood among the others, a ragged line of men reshaped by years of stone and silence. The gates of Blackwood yawned wide before us, their iron bars casting long shadows on the ground I had come to know too well. As I stepped beyond those walls, the weight I'd carried for 15 years felt lighter yet somehow hollow. Freedom tasted strange bitter and sweet mingled in the cold morning air. The streets of London beyond were unchanged, bustling with lives that hadn't paused for me. I was a stranger returned to a world that had moved on. I carried with me only the letter I had written, my testament, my confession, my companion through endless nights. It was folded carefully, tucked in the pocket of my worn coat, a fragile piece of the man I once was. I wandered toward Harrow Hall, though I knew it had long since passed into other hands. The estate, once a kingdom, now stood silent under a graying sky. The gates were locked tight, the grand facade worn and faded. No light shone from the windows. I stood before the gates, the cold biting through my coat. For a moment, I imagined Edward on the other side watching, indifferent, perhaps unaware of the man who had carried his sins behind bars. With trembling hands, I pulled the letter from my pocket. The words I had poured onto paper all those years ago weighed heavily in my palm. Without looking back, I tore it in two and let the wind scatter the pieces into the darkening sky. Some promises break quietly. Some chains fall with a single breath. I was free, but I was no longer the man who had walked through those gates all those years ago. Freedom was a strange companion. silent, elusive, and heavy with expectations I no longer understood. The city pulsed around me, full of life and color, but I felt like a ghost drifting through a world that had no place for me. Streets I once knew had changed. Faces were unfamiliar, or too familiar in their indifference. The Harrow estate was just a memory etched in cracked stone and rusted gates. I rented a small room in a run-down neighborhood where the walls were thin and the nights long. The loneliness settled deep, a shadow I could not escape. I found no solace in the noise or the silence. At times, I tried to rebuild to find work, to find purpose. But the marks of Blackwood clung to me. My hands trembled when holding tools, my eyes flinched at sudden sounds, and my thoughts often spiraled into the darkness I had fought to survive. Letters I once dreamed of sending to Edward were left unwritten. The man I had once served, the man who had sacrificed me, had become a stranger lost in the fog of my memories. I often wondered if forgiveness was a bridge too far, if freedom meant learning to live with the scars rather than healing them. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was mine to walk. Years have passed since I tore that letter to the wind, and still the silence remains. Not the silence of freedom, but the silence of a life half lived, a voice half heard. I stand now at the edge of what was and what could have been. The walls of Blackwood are long gone, swallowed by time and neglect, but their shadow lingers in the corners of my mind. I am no longer Daniel Gray, valet to Edward Harrow. I am no longer the man who took a fall for another's sins. I am a man who has learned that loyalty can be a cage as much as a gift, that justice is not always blind, but often bought and sold, that freedom can be given and taken in the same breath. As I close this chapter of my life, I do so without bitterness, only a quiet hope that someday someone will hear the stories left unspoken, and perhaps learn that the price of silence is paid not just by the guilty, but by those who stand in their place. The cell was silent, but I lived inside it. And now, at last, I walk away,